It's time for a Bible story. Our story begins a long time ago in the land of Israel. There was a man named Jesse, and Jesse lived in the town of Bethlehem. Jesse had 8 sons. The youngest was named David. David's job was to watch his father's sheep, and boy were they smelly. David's 7 older brothers were far away in the battlefield, but David was back home in Bethlehem, watching the smelly sheep. His job could get boring, so while he was hanging out in the fields, he taught himself to think about God's Word. He spent sunup to sundown memorizing parts of the Bible. He even wrote songs on his harp about God. David was good at his job. One day, a lion tried to eat one of his lambs, but David totally killed that lion. Another time, a bear attacked, and David killed it too. Now, while this was going on, David's brothers were being attacked by some wicked people, giant people. No, seriously, they were giants. Leading them was a huge jerk named Goliath. The very sight of him struck fear into the hearts of his enemies. Goliath shouted with his deep, booming voice for Israel to send their strongest warrior to fight him. The fight would be to the death. But nobody in the army of Israel would accept the challenge, not even the king. One day, bringing food to his brothers, David saw the giant Goliath and saw that his brothers were afraid. David said, "I killed a lion and a bear, and this giant who doesn't have a covenant with God will be just like one of them, because he has cursed the armies of the living God." David went and chose 5 smooth stones from a brook. With his sling in hand, David made his way to fight the giant. Goliath laughed. "You send a boy? I will feed your body to the birds of the air and the wild animals." David boldly answered back, "I come to you in the name of the Lord, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have cursed. Today I will give the bodies of your whole army to the birds of the air and the beasts of the field." And that's exactly what David did. David ran at the giant and sent a stone through the air, striking Goliath and sinking into his forehead. The giant fell to the ground. Then, David cut off his head. When the giant's army saw what happened to their leader, they all ran away like tiny little girls. That day, the boy David stood in victory over Goliath. The end.
And so we are starting a brand new series today called Jesse's Boy, and it's really all about David. And the cool thing is, for me, I love stories. I love reading stories. I enjoy reading stories to my kids. I read, 20, 30 books a year. I think my best year ever, I read over 50 books. So I just love stories, and I love to read stories and tell stories, and I'm not a very good storyteller. So when my kids were little, I would tell them stories, and so my oldest son, Jordan, he's 15 now, I would tell him stories when he was maybe 3 or 4 years old. And I wasn't very good at it, but we would just make them up as we went, and I would let him be a part of it, so he loved them so much. And so I would just be like, "Hey, Jordan, we're going to tell a story tonight for bed. What do you want the story to be about?" And so he created characters, and he told me what the story was going to be about, and then I just filled everything in. And so we finally settled on this one character that we talked about a lot, and his name was Noah. Not Noah like with the ark, but Noah the ninja. Noah was a ninja, and ninjas, you know what ninjas do. They fight things. And so every night I'd be like, "Okay, what story do you want to hear tonight?" And he'd be like, "I want to hear about Noah." I said, "Okay, what's Noah doing tonight?" He'd be like, "Fighting a tiger or fighting other ninjas," because that's what ninjas do. They fight. And so they fight each other, and they fight other monsters and animals and people. And so we would tell stories every single night and make them up as we went along the way. And it would really be funny because sometimes he'd be like, "I want to hear the one about Noah and the lion again." And I don't remember the story. That was like 4 nights ago, and I'm really bad at this. And so he would help me because he would always remember everything. So he'd help me along the way. And I was asking about it this week because he's 15 now and he's really cool. And he doesn't know about Noah and the ninja. He doesn't remember these. I remember them. He doesn't remember them at all. I think maybe he's lying, but he's too cool to tell me. But we love stories. I mean, don't we all? We really do love stories. It's why like movies and TV, that's like why it's really become such a part of our life. You know, like the average person spends like 8 hours a day watching TV. It's pretty ridiculous. It's because we love stories. What we really love about stories is when we can find ourselves in them. For some, we watch stories to escape, but what makes a really good story really good is that we find ourselves in the story. There's something about the character that we can really relate to. So if we can relate to them, then we enjoy the story. It's why some people like some stories and some people don't like the same exact story, because it's about relatability. The thing I love about the Old Testament is it's full of all these stories that happen. Really, the whole Bible is a story. It's a story from beginning to end that kind of brings us from the start of God and creation all the way to the end and what's going to happen there. And it's this story about God interacting with his people. And so the Old Testament is full of all these individuals. We usually call them characters, right? Like you grow up as a kid, and especially David and Goliath. You learn about those in Sunday school or in kids' church. And we call them characters. And I understand why we do that, but the reality is they're not characters. They're real people who lived real lives. And the reason why we can relate to them is because none of them were perfect. They all made mistakes, and we can relate with each and every single one of them. And so I love some of these old stories in the Old Testament. And so for the next few weeks, we're going to be digging in on this character named David. David really is the most epic of all the Bible stories, when you think about it, of all the people that are in the Bible. More is written about David than anyone else in the Bible not named Jesus. So there's more dedicated to David than anyone not named Jesus. So in the Old Testament, there are 66 chapters of the Old Testament that are dedicated to David's life. In the New Testament, he's mentioned 59 times. It's this huge epic tale that we get David and Goliath from, which is probably the most popular and most famous little biblical story for kids especially. But all this is about one man. And the funny thing is that we don't really find him there when we first hear the story. Like David comes from a nowhere town and a nobody family, and he really is the least of all of them. David's beginnings are anything but epic. They're anything but like the things that legends are made out of. He becomes the story of legend, but he doesn't start out that way. As a matter of fact, when we first meet David, David is like the forgotten son of Jesse. Jesse has 8 sons, and the youngest one is David. And like to understand this, the prophet Samuel shows up. And we're going to go back, and I want to kind of tell you some story in just a minute. But the prophet Samuel shows up in this little town called Bethlehem, and he says, we're going to sacrifice, and we're going to feast, and we're going to worship God. And for that to happen in that one town, you got to understand how much of a momentous occasion that would be. Because the prophet of God doesn't just show up in any little podunk town and say, we're going to have a feast. So when Samuel shows up, and then he shows up at the house of Jesse and says, I want to meet all of your sons. Like, think of how Jesse would feel in that. It would be like the president out of nowhere, you didn't know he was coming, showed up, knocked on your door and said, hey, I want to meet your kids. Like, it's a big deal. So you get everybody dressed up as nice as they can, you clean the house real quick, and you present your kids to the president. Well, Samuel shows up into Jesse's house. He speaks for God in a society that everything revolves around the worship of this God. And this is the one man who speaks for him. He shows up and he says, I want to meet all of your sons. And Jesse says, absolutely, you can meet them all. And he brings in all of them but David. Like, he's the forgotten son. He's this epic tale of a kid who didn't start with an epic life. Like, his father didn't think enough of him to bring him to the party. His father didn't think enough of him to bring him when the prophet said, I want to meet all your sons. And so then the prophet goes through meeting them all and says, this can't be it. We know why he was there. Jesse didn't know why he was there at the moment. He says, it can't be, you have to have another son. And he says, oh, well, I mean, there's just David. And he's out in the field tending sheep. Like, even then, he didn't want to bring David in. Like, he didn't think David was worthy enough at that moment to bring and present to Samuel. Even after Samuel said, there's got to be one more. He's like, yeah, I mean, there kind of is, but he's out there and he smells like sheep and you don't want to meet him. So it's this epic tale that doesn't start in an epic place. He's not this bigger than life character from the start. He becomes that because of what God does in his life. It doesn't start there. And so why then does God choose David? That's the big question. If his own father didn't see anything special in him, right? Like, I'm a father of 3 boys. And I can't imagine looking at any of my kids and not seeing anything special in their lives. Like, all 3 of them are special. And I see greatness in all 3 of them. Like, it might just be because I'm dad, but that's my job as dad, to see greatness in my children, right? So if I were to explain to you my 3 children, which all 3 are completely different personalities, raised in the same home, the same DNA, 3 completely different children, I'd tell you this, that my oldest son, Jordan, he's probably the smartest Grapham that's ever lived. He's brilliant. His genius is just intense. Now, he suffers in some social areas, but he's brilliant. And his mind, just the way it works and the way he learns, and school comes so easy for him. Like, he didn't do homework one time this whole school year that just ended. He didn't bring work home one time. He had a couple projects he had to work on because they were bigger projects, but not one time did he bring homework home. And he has a 3.9 GPA in all honors classes in high school. Like, how do you do that? You know, he doesn't study for tests. He's not like, I got a big test tomorrow, I got to study. When it came to the EOCs and the EOGs, like, he finishes them in 30 minutes and gets 5s. It's ridiculous how smart he is. Like, I see my son and I see that in him. My second son, Connor, he's like a gentle giant. He's 12 and he's 5'7". It's ridiculous. But he's so gentle and so kind. And Connor lives in his own world, but it's a happy world. So I let him stay there. He's never met a stranger. He's always pretty much in a good mood, and he just loves life. He can walk up to an adult and just strike up a conversation. It's funny to watch him do it because he's like, hey, how's the weather? Like it's just, he does these things because he doesn't meet strangers. And I say that like Jordan has the brains, Connor has the heart. He's got this huge, compassionate, loving heart. Like he'll cry quick when he sees injustice. Like I see greatness in him. I see that in him. My littlest one is 7 years old, Brady, and he's the one with the charm in the group. Like he's got the smile and he knows how to use it, right? So he's just, he can manipulate you like that. Don't fall for it. Go ahead and fall for it. He's my son. Just love on him. But like, he can have you eaten out of the palm of his hand in a second. He's got all the charm and he knows how to use it at 7 years old. Like I see those qualities in all of my children. I can't imagine having us he has 8, so like the 8th one doesn't matter. But Jesse doesn't even see enough in his son to bring him to the table. So why then would God choose David? If his own father didn't see enough in him to bring him to the party when the prophet shows up, why did God choose him? And so that's what I really want to unpack over these next few weeks. But in order to understand why God chose David, we have to understand a little bit about the history. So I just want to tell the story of Israel real quick to you. And I'm going to go fast, and I apologize because we took so long doing Nicaragua stuff. But I'm going to go fast. I'm going to give you a couple points, and then we will send you home today. But I want to kind of go back to the beginning. To understand why God chose David, you have to understand what happened before he chose David, to really understand why God chose him. And if you understand why God chose him, you'll understand why God chooses anyone. So when you understand why God chose David, you'll understand why he would choose you or not choose you for his call upon your life. And so to understand that, you got to go back to the beginning. So God calls this man named Abraham. He says, Abraham, get up from where you are. I'm going to take you to a place, and everywhere you set your feet, I'm going to give to you. And so off Abraham goes. And he shows him this land that he's going to give to him. And he makes Abraham this promise: I'm going to make a great nation out of you. Now, Abraham's already an old man and has no children. So this is quite the boastful promise that God makes him. I'm going to make a great nation out of you. The members of your people, it's going to be as numerous as like the sand, on the shore, as the stars in the sky. So he makes Abraham this promise, and he's already old. But God comes through, and he has children, and he has a son, and his son's name is Isaac. And so because of the promise that God made Abraham, the promise then passes on to Isaac. And the family begins to grow. And they become wealthy, and they become influential, but they're still just a family. So the patriarch was Abraham, then it's passed on to Isaac. Isaac has children, and he has 2 twin sons, Jacob and Esau. Esau is actually the oldest. He's the one that the family line is supposed to pass down to. But because Jacob sneaks in when Isaac is old and steals the blessing of God then goes from Isaac to Jacob. And Jacob has to run for fear that his brother is going to kill him because he's just taken basically he now has to become the patriarch. The blessing falls to him. And so his older brother, of course, would kill him over it. And so he runs. And while he's away, God does some things in his life. And God blesses him in spite of him. God blesses Jacob not because Jacob is a great man of God. God blesses Jacob because he had promised Abraham something. So his promise is still fulfilled. So he continues to bless Jacob. And then one night when Jacob's on his way home to make things right with his brother, he meets God in the middle of the night, and they literally wrestle. And God injures his hip and renames him and names him Israel. That's where we get the nation of Israel from. And so he ends up having a lot of sons. God's blessing continues to flow. There's a great famine. He has a son that is sold into slavery by his other sons. So these are great people. Everybody's broken. We all make mistakes. And so Joseph goes into Egypt as a slave, somehow rises to power, becomes the second most powerful man in Egypt. He brings his family to Egypt, to a safe place. They begin to grow, and God blesses them. The Egyptians get fearful. At some point in time, something happens where they change pharaohs. The new pharaoh gets really fearful of the amount of Israelites that are living in his country, so he enslaves them. And for hundreds of years, they're slaves. Moses is raised up. He comes along, sets them free. They go into the wilderness. They spend 40 years in the wilderness, and then finally they get to the promised land that God had promised Abraham all that time ago that he could have. They cross the Jordan River, and the only problem is this, is that the land's already inhabited by a lot of people. And if you want to inhabit it, you're going to have to clear it out. And so for 5 years, they do battle. They war on every city, on every king, on every group of people, and God continues to bless them. And actually what they end up doing is dividing the land in half and fighting one half and then the other. And even later on, it becomes 2 kingdoms, but for a while. But they go in and they take the land. Now it's time to be a nation, right? Like they've only ever been a family before. They had a family with a patriarch, a leader. Even when Moses brought them up out of Egypt, they were the Israelites. They just had been this group of tribes, this group of families all together. And so when they decided that they were going to form some sort of governmental structure, what do? They say, we want the same thing that everyone else has. We want a king. It's It's like they had a king, and they have a king, and Egypt has a pharaoh, and all these great nations. They have kings. We want a king too. We should have a king. And God says, no, you can't have a king. But we want a king. No, you can't have a king. I'm your king. I want to be your king. You're different. I've called you out. You can't have a king. I want to be your king. Instead, what God does, he raises up what we call the judges. If you ever get a chance to go into the Old Testament and read the book of Judges, it's really one of my favorites in the Old Testament, because it's just these quick stories of these judges and the amazing things that they did. So for hundreds of years, they had these judges, and every time Israel messes up, and then God kind of takes his hand off of them, and then the oppressors come in, and then they cry back out for God, and then God comes in and saves them, and he raises up a judge to do that. Then the judge leads. The word judge there really means leader, not like black robe and gavel, leader. So he raises up leaders. So you have all these judges. Finally, you come to this judge. His name is Samuel. He's also the high priest, and he's also a prophet. So he fills many roles, and he's also the judge of Israel. But the people have been clamoring for a king again. And so they call out for a king, and they call out for a king, and they call out for a king, and Samuel keeps saying, no, you can't have a king, no, you can't have a king, no, you can't have a king. And finally Samuel gets upset, and he goes to God, and he's like, these people, they keep crying out for a king, what do I do? And God tells him, it's okay, they're not rejecting you, Samuel. They're rejecting me. So we're going to give them a king. Let them reject me and let them see what it's like with a king. And so it's time to select a king. And so the people go out and they select a king. And they do what probably you and I would do as well. They select a king for who looks like and seems like he would be the best king. So they select a guy named Saul. And the Bible tells us this about Saul. It says that he's the tallest man in all Israel. He's a head above everyone else. So he's the tallest man. So he looks the role. He's also from a very wealthy and influential family. His father was a wealthy merchant. They were very influential. So he's rich. He's influential. He's from the right family. He's taller than everyone. The Bible also says he's the best looking man in all of Israel. So he's probably got a beard. Probably like, see what you're seeing right here? Probably something similar to this right here, right? Just good looking, like, chiseled, probably the body of a Greek god. You know what I'm saying? Like, he just looks the part of a king. Rocking a sweet beard, all that stuff. So he looks like a king more than anyone else looks like a king. And they say he's from the right family. He looks the part. He's tall. He's mighty. He's a warrior. Man, he's handsome. He's got a great oiled beard. He's our new king. And they make Saul the king. And on the outside, everything looks and feels great. And God begins to bless the kingdom and bless Saul. So Saul leads his people in some battles, and they're successful. And at the time, the Philistines ruled over them. And the Philistines were a very wicked group of people. They had 5 kings who all worked together and followed a god called Dagon. And they had control over Israel. And at the time, they had so much control over Israel, they decided that we don't want these people rising up against us. And so they outlawed weapons and armor and any kind of smiths. So Israel wasn't even allowed to have people who could make weapons and armor, repair things. So anytime you needed a plow fixed, you had to go to the Philistines and have them fix your plow, things like that. And so Saul raises up an army, really, of farmers with pitchforks and, axes or whatever they get their hands on. They didn't have weapons, and they win a great battle. It seems like God is blessing them. And this begins to happen, and everything seems great. The problem is that on the outside, Saul is exactly what they think they want in a king, but on the inside, he's the opposite. Saul's incredibly insecure, and Saul is a people pleaser. He just wants people to like him. And so instead of doing God's will, he'll do anything he can to keep people happy. And so Saul begins to make some mistakes. And the promise that God made Saul when he made him king was this. He says, as long as you obey my commandments, as long as you do that, then your family will remain as king. But when you disobey my commandments, your family can no longer, reign as kings. Because most kings, it's lineage, right? So as long as you obey my commandments, your family will sit on the throne. And Saul starts thinking that Saul is all that. He starts thinking that all of the victories are his. And he's the one that's caused them. The people are following him because they love him, and he's a great, mighty warrior. He doesn't realize the blessing that God has on him. Plus, he wants to keep people happy. So Saul makes a mistake. And Saul goes out, and he's ready to do this big battle. And there's a large army there, and they're ready to come in. And Saul's afraid. All the soldiers are afraid because they're vastly outnumbered. They're outgunned. They're out-armored. They're out-weaponed. And they need God for this. And they need to make sacrifice, but Samuel isn't there to make the sacrifice. Only Samuel could make the sacrifice as the prophet and as the high priest. And so he wants the sacrifice to be made, and Samuel sends him this message. In 7 days, I'll be there. You have to wait 7 days. In 7 days, I'll be there. We'll sacrifice. We'll go, and we'll defeat this army. And on the 7th day, Saul's looking for Samuel, and Samuel's not there yet. So Saul goes and makes the sacrifice anyways, because his troops are actually leaving. They're slipping out in the night and leaving him. So he has less and less troops every single day for 7 days, and he's afraid, and he wants to keep those troops, so he makes the sacrifice. And as he's finished making the sacrifice, Samuel walks in. And he's like, what are you doing? And Saul answers him, He has an excuse for him. And he says, well, I had to save my troops. And really, this is the point. And I'll just kind of tell you the point because we got to get through this because I know we're running out of time. But the point is this, is that Saul had a chance here, an opportunity, I believe, to make things right. Samuel shows up and he says, what are you doing? Why did you make the sacrifice? And Saul, in that moment, because of his lack of character, his lack of integrity, his insecurities, instead of saying, you're right, I made a mistake. I'm sorry. God, please forgive me. Samuel, forgive me. Instead, Saul gives excuses. And when he gives those excuses, instead of entering back into the covenant that God had with him, he owns or he lives with his mistakes and decides that his mistakes were right because he had these reasons. And so he makes up an excuse for his sin. And when he does that, God removes kingship from him. Now, he doesn't remove kingship from him in that moment. He removes it from his line, from his family. He gets to remain king, but his son is never going to become king. So Saul makes that mistake. Years later, he makes another mistake. He's going to fight a king called Agag. It's an awesome name. And Agag, God says, well, you're going to destroy them. I'm going to give you victory, but here's the deal. You have to kill everyone and everything, and you have to burn everything. Now, I don't know why God said to do this. Like kill old people, kill women, kill children. I don't know why God said that. Don't just kill the troops, kill the king, kill everyone, kill the livestock and all the animals, and don't even bring back what you plunder, gold and silver and materials. Burn them all. Like you can take nothing from here. And so Saul goes out and he wins the great victory that God had promised him. But instead of doing what God says, he captures the king as his prisoner and troops him back to Israel. He takes all kinds of women so that they can be slaves and wives of his troops. He takes plunder, all kinds of gold and silver. He does all these things, and he takes the livestock as well. He keeps it all. And so he gets back, and Samuel comes up to him again and says, what have you done? You're so foolish. What are you doing? And he says, no, I've done everything that God told me to do. I did what God told me to do. We went and we destroyed them. And he says, and what's the bleating of sheep that I hear? And once again, Saul has an opportunity here. He can realize his mistake and make it right, or he can make up an excuse. And he makes up an excuse again. He says, oh, well, I kept all the livestock because we're going to make sacrifice to the Lord. And Samuel says this very important line to him. He says, obedience is better than sacrifice. And so God removes the kingship once again. And so I just want to read to you what happens there. 1 Samuel chapter 15, verses 30 through 31. So Saul wants to now go make this sacrifice, and Samuel refuses to go make the sacrifice with him. So Saul pleads with him, please come out and make this sacrifice. I just find it very interesting to show the character of Saul. It says, then Saul pleaded again, because he actually tore Samuel's shirt, because Samuel went to walk away. And he said, I know I have sinned, but please at least honor me before the elders. In other words, I only care what the elders think. I don't care what God thinks or you, the prophet, thinks. I just want the elders to think everything is still good. Right? So honor me before the elders of my people and before Israel by coming back with me. And then listen to this line here. So that I may worship the Lord your God. Not his God. It wasn't Saul's God. Samuel's God. The Lord your God. So Samuel finally agreed and went back with him, and Saul worshiped the Lord. And then the Bible says that Samuel, when he left Saul there, he never went back to Saul again. So Samuel goes off in the morning. What are we going to do? We have this king. He's wicked. He's evil. He's going against your will. You've now taken the kingship from his family. What are we going to do? And he goes off to mourn, and God shows up and says, why are you mourning? Get up. I got something for you to do. And he sends him to this little town called Bethlehem, which is where we meet David. And so I just want to tell you the story real quick of how he picks David and why. And then we will go ahead and get on out of here. So 1 Samuel chapter 16, verses 6 through 13. It says, when they arrived, this is the sons of Jesse. So he showed up at Jesse's house. He's called in his sons. It says, when they arrived, Samuel took one look at Eliab and thought, this is Jesse's oldest son, surely this is the Lord's anointed. You notice what he did there? He took one look at him, right? Remember how they picked Saul? Because he was taller and better looking and richer and more influential than everyone else. So he took one look at him and said, this must be the Lord's anointed. But the Lord said to Samuel, don't judge by his appearance or height, for I have rejected him. The Lord doesn't see things the way you see them. People judge by outward appearances, and that word outward appearances there literally translates by the face. So people judge by looking at someone's face. But the Lord looks at the heart. Then Jesse told his son Abinadab to step forward and walk in front of Samuel. But Samuel said, this is not the one the Lord has chosen. And it goes all the way through all the kids. Then Samuel asked, after he'd seen all of his sons, are these all the sons that you have? And he said, there is still the youngest, Jesse replied, but he's out in the fields watching the sheep and goats. In other words, he's not even worthy or worth bringing in him. So Samuel says, send for him at once. we will not sit down and eat until he arrives. So Jesse sent for him. When he was dark and handsome, so David was handsome as well. The Bible doesn't talk a lot about people's looks, but it does a few people. So he was dark and handsome with beautiful eyes. I don't know as a guy if that's the description I want for all eternity about me, but David had beautiful eyes. And where it says dark and handsome, some translations said he was ruddy-faced boy. He was ruddy-faced, which just means like he had this reddish kind of healthy glow to him, which makes sense because he was always outside in the sun watching sheep. So he has beautiful eyes. And the Lord said, this is the one, anoint him. And so David stood there among his brothers. Samuel took a flask of olive oil, and he had brought and anointed David with the oil, which means he literally just poured it over his head so it would run down over his body. And the Spirit of the Lord came powerfully upon David from that day on. So why did God choose David, this little ruddy-faced boy who had beautiful eyes, I guess? Why would God choose him? The reason is this. It says it right there. When you look at a man, you judge him by the outside. When I look at a man, I judge him by the heart, what's on the inside. Now, for us to understand that, we've got to understand what the heart meant in that society to those people at that time. For us, the seat of intelligence, intellect, is in the brain. The seat of emotion, we say, is in the heart. Now, we know that the heart isn't really the seat of emotion, right? We know that it's just a muscle that pumps blood, but that's still how we look at it, right? So all thought comes from the brain, emotion comes from the heart, right? So you get heartbroken. The heart isn't really broken, but you just feel that way, right? For the ancient Jew, and really most people around the world, it wasn't like that. Actually, the heart was kind of the seat of all of it. The heart was the center of all life. And so the seat of intellect actually was the heart. It's where all your thoughts came from. And so they didn't look at the brain as the seat of thought. They looked at the heart as that. And so when God says, I look at the heart, what he's talking about to them is he's looking at the totality of a man. All of his emotions and all of who he is in his character, all of his thought life and his thought process, all of those things bundled into one. Everything that makes him a person, that's what I look at. I look at the heart. And so the question we're going to be asking for these next probably 6 weeks is this: how's your heart? Because that's the question God would ask you today. You want God to do something in your life? You want him to use you for something? How's your heart? Do you have the kind of heart, everything that's inside of you, your thought process, your emotional center, everything of who you are, do you have the kind of heart that God wants to use? For David, he had that. And we're going to be looking at, over the next several weeks, what different aspects of his heart, what they were. Because David and Saul were really the opposite people. Because David made decisions differently than Saul did. Now, David wasn't perfect. We're going to talk about that in just a moment. But what God saw in David and didn't see in Saul is his heart. And when he looks at you and he wants to use you, when you want to do great things for him, or when you don't do great things in life and you're wondering, why isn't God blessing me the way he is others? My question to you is this: how's your heart? Because it's a matter of the heart, because that's what God's looking at. He's not looking at your house and the car that you drive and the name on the tag on your clothes. He's not looking at how much it costs you to get your hair done. He doesn't look at any of that, what kind of shoes you're wearing. He looks at the heart, what's on the inside of a person. That's what's much more important. So what does that mean? Because me as a guy, I struggle with that. Like I kind of, I'm not mushy and I'm not an emotional kind of guy. So I kind of struggle with that thought. Because like David played a harp and like wrote songs and poems and stuff. I don't do that. So like, what does that all mean? And so I'll kind of boil it down to this week real quick before you go. If you have your notes, take them out, because here's where you're going to write. It's kind of two things I want to point out real quick. The first thing is this: it's spirituality. Let's talk about your spirituality. And that's a struggle for some people. For me, I've never considered myself to be an overly spiritual person. I'm just not. I never have. At least not by the standards that I feel like I was always taught growing up of what a spiritual person was. And I'm not taking a shot at anything. I love my upbringing. I love the churches that I was a part of. But I always felt like in the churches I was a part of, if you weren't clapping and singing and hands raised and ready to do a Jericho march around the church, like if you're the one that wanted to stay there in the pew while everybody did all the crazy stuff, like you were looked at as not being a spiritual person. And so I really struggled with my spirituality. And so here I was, a young man, I'm in Bible college, and I feel like I'm going to go be a pastor, and I'm not even a spiritual person. I really, really struggled with that until I came across Galatians chapter 6, verses 1 through 10. And Paul writes this in Galatians chapter 6, verse 1. He says, "For those of you who are spiritual," and my ears perked up when I heard that. Because at the moment and in that time in my life when I'm sitting there in Bible college struggling with the fact that I'm not a spiritual person, at least not by the standards that I was taught made you spiritual, I'm struggling with that idea and saying, so my ears perked up. Okay, what is a spiritual person then? And then he goes on to list 3 or 4 things that make you a spiritual person. For those of you who are spiritual, do this, 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 and this. And what I realized when I read that was that he wasn't talking about the hyper-spiritual bubble that we get on Sunday mornings while we're singing songs. That doesn't make you a spiritual person. That can be an outflow of your spirituality, but that's not what makes you a spiritual person or not. What makes you a spiritual person is how you live your life Monday through Saturday, not what you do on Sunday morning within the hyper-spiritual bubble of the church. And so I started learning how to live spiritually Monday through Saturday. And here's what a spiritual person is. Are you ready for this? This is what David was above all. He was a poet, and he wrote psalms, and he was a harpist, and all those good things. What he was above everything else is he was a man of action. True spirituality is this. It's faith in action. It's no mistake that we're coming out of James and going into a life on David, because James talks about faith in action. Faith without works is dead. What good is your faith if you can't put some action behind it? David lived that kind of life. When he believed something, he went after it and did it and made it happen. So he shows up at the camp when Goliath is out there taunting them, and everyone is quivering and afraid of Goliath, and he says, hold on a second, he's defiling our God and defying our God. I can't let this happen. I'm going to go take action. See, true spirituality is faith in action. It's when you take what you believe and you put it into work every single day in the concrete areas of your life. And that looks like so many different things in so many areas, but it simply is that, faith in action. Be a person of action. If you believe this, then live this every single day, no matter who is watching and no matter what's going on around you. So it doesn't matter the things the guys like to talk about at work. If you don't believe that those are appropriate things to be a part of your life, then act on it and don't be involved in those conversations. It's faith in action. It's about taking authority over the things that are in your life. I was reading this for our group on Wednesday night. We had our first week of groups. And Paul has this prayer in Ephesians for his people and for God's people. And one of the prayers is that you would know the power that God has. The reason why he has that prayer for them, that you would understand the power that God has, is because in order to act on your faith, you're going to have to understand the power that God has for you in your life. That he's a powerful God and his power is available to you. Jesus said this. He said, all authority in heaven and earth has been given unto me. Like, authority has to be given. You realize that, right? Like, nobody has authority without it being given to them by someone. A dictator has authority because the people fear him, and by fearing him, they give him authority. A president has authority because we vote him into office and give him the authority. Nobody has authority without it being given to them except for God himself, because he's where all authority comes from. So Jesus says, all authority in heaven and earth has been given to me, now go, right? What's he saying when he says that? He's saying, I have all authority, now I'm giving you the same authority to go and live your life. So be a person of faith and action. Put it into action because you have authority to do so. That temptation that you're struggling with, it doesn't have authority over you. You have authority over it. Act. The sin that you can't seem to get out of, it doesn't have authority over you. You have authority over it. Now act. Be a person of faith and action. David was a person of action. That's what it means to be a spiritual person. The second thing is this. It's integrity. David was a man of integrity. Now before you go, wait, hold on, David messed up. I'll agree with you. David messed up many times. The first one that comes to mind is Bathsheba, right? David commits adultery and then murders her husband. Like, that doesn't sound like a person of integrity. Here's the difference. This, I believe, is the major difference between Saul and David. It's this issue of integrity. Because when the prophet comes to David and says, you messed up, David immediately laments and repents every single time. He's just a man, so he's imperfect and he makes mistakes and he's got a lot of power to wield. That's a difficult thing for a man. So he makes mistakes, but when the mistakes are brought to his attention, he makes them right. You know what true integrity is? It's not just like living the way you're supposed to live when no one's watching, right? Like we love to boil it down to that, and it's this really fun little fluffy thing. Real integrity is this. It's making it right when you've gotten it wrong. When David gets it wrong, he makes it right every single time. There's no greater story for that in David's life than he made a mistake. I won't get into all what the mistake was, but the prophet comes to him and says, God has given you 3 options. You're going to be punished by God for this mistake, and you have 3 options. Number 1, you can choose. It's your choice, David, what your punishment is. 1 is you can choose 3 years of famine in the land. So your whole kingdom will suffer 3 years if you choose that. Second thing is you can choose for 3 months for your enemies to chase you, which means you won't win battles for 3 months. Instead, your armies will be chased and defeated for 3 months. That's your other choice. The third choice is this. For 3 days, there will be a great plague in the land. Now, it's easy for us to sit here and go, I choose 3 days over 3 years, right? But the reality is this. For David, this choice was this. 3 years of famine, which means people will starve. People will go hungry. Lives will be lost. People will suffer. You know who won't? David. He's the king. King's not going to starve. There will be food on the king's table. So if he chooses 3 years of famine, his people are punished for his mistake, but he's not. That's an easy one to pick if you're the king. For 3 months, your armies will be chased by your enemies. So widows will be made. Mothers will lose children. Children will lose fathers as soldiers die. But you know who won't be killed in battle? The king, because he can hide behind his walls, sitting on his throne. Or he can be at the battle and just be in the back. And he can be the first to flee on his fancy horse, because he's the king. So in other words, the people would be punished, but David wouldn't. That's an easy one to choose if you're the king. The third one's the much hardest one. It's the harder one. Because no walls will keep out the plague. That a plague is a plague. And it doesn't matter your position, sickness is sickness. And so his family would be affected by the plague as well. And David has a choice to make as the king. And the choice he makes is this. He says, then give me the 3 days of plague. Why? Because that's the only way his family would be punished too. There was an equal chance that he or one of his family members would get the plague than it was anyone else in the whole kingdom. And so that's the punishment he chooses. That's a man of integrity. He made a mistake. He owned up to his mistake. He repented of his mistake. And then instead of allowing others to be punished for him, he takes the punishment himself as well. He was a man of great integrity. So how do we gain a heart after God's? Twice in the Bible it says this about David. He had a heart after God's own heart. Twice it said about that. How do we do that? Real quick, and then we're out of here. We're going to fly through these last 4 things. It's this. You have to invest into your relationship with God. See, David was out there watching sheep, but he wasn't just watching sheep. He was praying. He was spending time with God. He was learning how to get a hold of God's ear. He was learning how to get into God's presence. He invested into his relationship with God. He wrote psalms and songs and poems about his God. He did all those things. Now, I'm not doing those things. I'm just not. You don't listen. You don't want to hear a poem I wrote. I promise. Promise you don't. It will be bad, ugly, terrible. Children will cry. Just bad things will happen. Floods, disasters. Okay? You don't want me to write a poem. I can't do those things. But I can invest in my relationship with God. You need to invest in your relationship with his too. The only way to gain God's heart is to get close to God's heart. And the Bible says is as you draw near to him, he draws near to you. You see, he doesn't go anywhere. He's just there waiting for you. So if you feel right now in this moment, you're like, I'm furthest from God I've ever been in my life. I'm not close to him. That's okay, because he's still where you left him. You're the only one that's moved, I promise. If you don't feel close to God today, you're the only one that's moved. All you have to do is move back, invest. And so I just want to give you a couple tips, real practical things, ways that you can invest with us this summer. And the first one is this, is just be here. Like for the next 6 weeks while we learn about what the heart is supposed to be here. I know it's summertime. I know the beach is a couple hours away. The mountains are a couple hours away. There's lakes all around. I get it. The sun's out and it's shining and all that stuff. I get it. It's summertime. Be here. Invest in your time in God's house. You know where God is on Sunday mornings? He's in his house. Yeah, he's out there too. But he's in his house. See, the Bible says that he inhabits the praises of his people. And where 2 or more gathered together, there he will be in their midst. We gather here on Sunday mornings to praise him and together. He's here. You want to invest in your relationship with him, be here. So don't skip out on this series. Make plans to be here. Don't make plans to skip. Make plans to be here. Be in his house, in his presence, with his people, learning his word. That's one way to invest. The second way is this. Give. Give. This is something we haven't talked about a whole lot here at this church. In fact, we've never taken an offering. So this is not me trying to get money out of you. We've never received an offering in this church. We're going on our 10th month, and never once have we taken up an offering. We give you an opportunity to give on your way out if you want to, but we don't receive an offering here. So this isn't my way just to get you to somehow give to me. This is not it. But giving is an issue of obedience. The Bible is very clear on the issue of giving. So if you're here and you're giving, you're not tithing, maybe you're giving a little bit or you're not giving, give, invest in what God is doing and he will invest in you. That's the only thing in the Bible that I know of that comes with a blessing and a curse, depending on what side of it you're on. So you get to choose which side of that you're on. You get to choose the blessing or choose the curse. That's your choice. My job is to teach you that. And so that's what I'm doing today. I'm just asking you, give. Give. Be obedient. Samuel said this, obedience is better than sacrifice. And so many times on this issue, I hear people talk about all the things they're sacrificing, right? I'm serving every single week, and I'm doing this, and I'm giving to that over there, and I'm doing this over here. Obedience is better than sacrifice. Be obedient. It amazes me how people cry out and say, well, God isn't blessing me in this area, but they're just simply not being obedient in the most basic and simple of ways. Invest in what God is doing, and he will invest in you. Give. Third thing is this, serve. I say serve as a member of Team Oaks, right? Show up and serve. If you're not already serving, serve. If you start doing for others, God will do for you. I've always believed that. Quickest way to get God to move in your situation is to help someone else in theirs. So whether that's here at Oaks Chapel, serving as a member of Team Oaks right here, inviting people and creating environments for people to meet God, that's one way to serve, and I want you to serve that way. But get out there and just serve people. Just do for others. And if you'll start doing God's will for others, he'll start doing his will for you. And so serve. And the fourth thing is this, is get in a group. Now it's summertime. We're a brand new church. We only have one group this semester. You received a little thing there. I do a Bible study on Wednesday nights. Get into a group. Because here's what happens when you get into a group. Number one, that's another opportunity for you to learn God's word. So you're investing in your relationship with him. But God is a relational God, and he created you to be a relational person. And so the goal was never to get you into rows, it was to get you into circles. And if you'll get into circles and start doing life with others, then you'll find out areas of your life opening up to God that never opened up before. Through relationship, because he's a relational God. And oftentimes our relationship here is lived out in our relationships here. It's not just between you and God. It's not a personal relationship with God. It's a shared relationship with God. He never called you to be on your own in relationship with him. He called you to be with others in relationship with him. This is a family. And so get into group. Make relationships and friendships and form bonds and learn a little bit about God. Like, here's the honest truth. Like, Bible study is the least important thing we do at group. Like, just come hang out. Like, that's it. Come hang out. Get to know somebody else, because you need people in your life that you're comfortable enough to let hear your mess. We've all got mess. We've all got stuff in our lives. The question isn't whether you have it or not. The question is who knows about it. Who knows about the stuff in your life? If you're the only person that knows about stuff in your life, you're in trouble. Somebody needs to know about the stuff in your life so you can be held accountable. James says this, that we confess our sins to God for forgiveness, but we confess them to each other for healing. We just studied that last week. Confess to God for forgiveness, confess to others for healing. True healing doesn't take place until somebody's in on your mess. So get into a group, invest in your relationship with God. I've gone way over and I apologize. My question to you today is, how's your heart? How's your heart? And can I tell you something? That question works in every area of your life, not just in your relationship with God. Having problems with your spouse? How's your heart towards your spouse? Issues with your kids? How's your heart? Having a hard time at work with coworkers? How's your heart towards your coworkers? Ask yourself that question this week. Every time you go to make a decision, what's the motives behind this? How's my heart? Every time you go to God in prayer, okay, how's my heart today? Towards God, towards the things of God, towards those in my life. How's your heart? The next 6 weeks, we're going to study David's heart and see what different aspects of his heart we can apply to our own lives so that we can be called and chosen to live an epic life that God called us to as well. Let's pray. Father, I just thank you so much for your word today. I thank you for your presence in this place. Lord, I thank you that you were able to send us to Nicaragua. I thank you for stories like David's that we can look at and find ourselves a little bit in the story. That I can look at him and see he wasn't perfect and he made mistakes, and maybe, just maybe, I'm a little bit like he is. And so maybe, just maybe, I have something I can learn from his life. And if I can learn from his life, then I can get closer to you. And if I'm closer to you, God, you can use me more. So today, help us to invest into our relationship with you so that we can fulfill all of the things that you promised us and have called us to. We praise you and we worship you today in Jesus' name. Amen.